Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this RSE event, which bears the title, a challenging title, A Healthy Message, Understanding the History and Exploring the Future of Public Health Campaigns in Scotland. Just before we start, I must point out the fire regulations. If there is a fire warning, please leave as rapidly as you can by the fire exits, which you will see there, and assemble in front of the George Hotel. Do not go into the bar at the George Hotel because we may summon you back, but that's where everybody is to assemble in the event of a fire. Now, this discussion this evening really could hardly be better timed. It's an extremely important subject, perhaps even the most challenging subject facing Scotland today. We have a new government with a new mandate. It's come in, as all new governments do, full of great promises, great ambitions. But we still, nevertheless, live in a country which has the reputation of having one of the worst health records in Europe. We drink more, we smoke more, we have poorer diets than elsewhere in the UK. Women in particular, the health of Scottish women is worse than their counterparts in England. There are higher incidences of heart disease, diabetes, cancer, multiple sclerosis. And yet, over the years, those of us who have lived in Scotland have had no lack of campaigns, of efforts by successive governments to shift that health record. And some of them have been better than others, some of them have been more effective than others, but I think it's safe to say that none of them have really dismantled that problem. It seems to me that there are two basic approaches. One is the top-down approach in which government legislates to attempt to achieve certain aims in improving health. And of course the smoking ban is a perfect example of that. And then we've got the new SNP government intent on introducing a minimum price for alcohol, which is another attempt to legislate to tackle the health record. And the other, which is perhaps the one that we're going to focus on a bit more this evening, is the bottom-up approach, the educational approach, the one which tries to tackle Scotland's culture of unhealthy living. And so that attempt to educate the public, I think, is what's going to engage us here, and the question of whether you can do that, whether you can change the habits of a lifetime, change that culture. I, in particular, am quite interested in the other subtext of all this, which is the way in which, the arts and humanities can come into this, whether if you're trying to change a culture, you should use cultural means of doing it. And I've actually got a perfect personal example of that, because I gave up smoking after seeing a very, very early, probably well before most of your lifetime, documentary on smoking, which was one of the most horrific things I've ever seen. The particular scene that sort of sticks in my mind was in a dissecting theatre where they had side by side two lungs, one the lungs of a healthy farmer who lived all his life in the countryside, and the other of somebody who'd been a lifelong smoker. And I still remember the sound of the knife sawing through this leather-like lung, and I thought, I do not want to have a lung like that, and I promptly gave up virtually overnight. It's maybe a rather simplistic example of what we're talking about, but nevertheless, I think the way in which we get that into the sort of what I always described as the bloodstream of the nation, is tremendously important, and I think there's no other way really in the end of doing it unless you just really get people to understand it at the core of their being. So in order to kick off this discussion, we have 4 speakers, tremendously experienced, quite argumentative, I may say. We've been having an argument about all sorts of irrelevant matters, such as Ryan Giggs, etc. He won't come into. I don't think, though. But they will provoke, I'm sure, discussion. So I'm going to kick off by asking Dr. James Mills to come up and start. Dr. Mills is from the University of Strathclyde, director of the Strathclyde end of the Centre for the Social History of Health and Healthcare in Glasgow. And he teaches and researches in 2 subject areas, the social history of drugs and the social history of health and medicine in the British Empire. I suppose we're still part of a British Empire. No, we're not really. But anyway, his experience in that area will be extremely interesting. He's actively working on 2 separate projects. First is the history of cannabis consumption and control, and the second is the history of psychiatry in India. And so these 2 areas show the breadth of his experience. So I'll now call on Dr. Mills to kick off our discussion.
Right, good evening everyone. It's nice to know that somebody does read our website. So it's a useful reminder what one writes on one's website ought to be updated every now and again. So thank you, Magnus. First of all, I should introduce myself. My name is Dr. James Mills. I work at the Centre for the Social History of Health and Healthcare, Glasgow, which is a collaboration between the University of Strathclyde and Glasgow Caledonian University. I'm a historian, and I hope to make clear that being a historian in the context of the discussion tonight is a good thing, and that historians and those more broadly from the arts and humanities have something new and interesting to offer those dealing with public health questions. First of all, I should say my thank yous. Thank you to the Royal Society of Edinburgh for organising this evening's event. Thanks also to the Arts and Humanities Research Council and to the Scottish Funding Council. Joe and Susan at the AHRC and David at the SFC have been instrumental really in helping me and others working in the arts and humanities in Scotland begin to think through how we engage more effectively with those working in the health professions and dealing more broadly with issues of public health in Scotland. And as a result of this, funding has now begun to flow into arts and humanities projects and into events such as this evening. So thanks very much to the AHRC, the SFC and the Royal Society. The question I'm going to answer tonight is the one that's up there on the slide for you. What on earth do the arts and humanities have to do with the future of public health in Scotland? What on earth do the country's historians, writers, artists, musicians and so on have to offer those trying to deal with Scotland's very real public health problems, the sort of problems that Magnus has begun to touch upon? I'll tell you when I first began worrying about this particular question, how do the arts and humanities contribute to these areas? It was back in 2007, at the Centre for the Social History of Health and Healthcare, the CSHH for short. We organised a conference back in 2007 to really look at and to mark the 50th anniversary of Glasgow's mass radiography campaign. Back in 1957, the campaign was a landmark in Scottish public health projects. Scotland had, over the course of the decade after World War II, emerged as the part of the UK that had by far the highest rates of TB infection. And of the Scottish cities, Glasgow distinguished itself by being the city which had the highest rates still. In many ways, the response by the middle of the 1950s was a model of interagency collaboration. The various departments of the new National Health Service liaised with the Secretary of State for Scotland and with the city's fathers in Glasgow to organise an intensive 5-week campaign. The objective of the campaign was to use 37 mobile radiography units manned by volunteers to identify TB carriers in the city. Very simply, these mobile radiography units would visit housing schemes, offices and factories with the initial aim of x-raying 250,000 members of the Glaswegian population. And through the x-rays, it would be possible to identify who was carrying TB and to treat them appropriately. In many ways, the campaign is remembered as such a success because it used the very latest marketing techniques. There were campaigns in the media, in the cinemas, in the newspapers. There were leafleting campaigns at factories and places of work. Such gimmicks, if you like to call them such, as there was a weekly prize draw. So if you turned up and you had your lungs x-rayed, you gave your name. Your names went into the hat and there was a car to be won. So there was a whole range of new techniques employed here to really encourage the Glaswegian population to engage with this. Such was the success of the programme that the original target of 250,000 people was far exceeded. And by the time the 5 weeks of the campaign ended, 715,000 members of the Glaswegian population had turned out for their x-rays. Going back 50 years, we found that Glasgow was very much a model of successful public health campaigning and of successful engagement between the local population and public health officials and professionals. The historians that we gathered for this conference found ourselves in a position where people from outside of history were beginning to ask us, what can we learn lessons from this success? What does the experience of 1957 tell us about approaching the public health challenges that we find in the contemporary world and particularly in contemporary Scotland? And this really was the origins of the reason I'm here speaking tonight. Because the question troubled me. I began to think, well, how do we learn lessons from these public health campaigns? And in particular, what does the 1957 experience tell us? The answer to this question, the answer that I reached, was actually that nothing could be learnt from this experience, which may surprise you, given that I'm a historian trying to make the case for my discipline in public health circles. The reason that nothing could be learnt from the 1957 campaign in Glasgow is that any good historian would tell you is that there was no basis for a comparison between the campaign in 1957 and between the public health challenges of 2007, or indeed of 2011. The TB campaign was focused on a single infectious disease that nobody wanted to have. Ultimately, there was also a quick technical fix at hand, which the administrators and the government officials could use in order to deal with this single infectious disease. This contrasts with the contemporary situation. Current public health concerns focus on far more complex problems and behaviours related to such issues as the consumption of alcohol, drugs and tobacco, the management of diets and nutrition, approaches to mental health, or indeed approaches to sedentary lifestyles and diet. Indeed, as I say, the technical fix available to the officials in Glasgow of the 1950s is simply not at hand for those trying to tackle contemporary problems, something which even the British government recently acknowledged. The new government's 2010 drugs strategy statement emphasised that individuals do not take drugs in isolation from what is happening in the rest of their lives. The causes and drivers of drug and alcohol dependence are complex and personal. The solutions need to be holistic. There is no technical fix. Indeed, I began looking more closely at the recent statements, contemporary statements on how to frame public health problems and ultimately how to begin finding solutions to them. What I noticed was that in place of the technical fix of the 1950s, there was an increasing focus on changing cultures. For example, the Royal Society's collection, the Royal Society of Edinburgh's collection of papers back in 2003 on Scotland's drug problem concluded that we need our politicians to be brave enough to examine the options. That can start with an open and honest debate, something Magnus may recall as I believe he was there. The suggestion here is essentially then about changing cultures within policy circles. Shifting the terms of the discussion seems to be fundamentally important in trying to reframe the issue of drug use. And the police, the media and politicians all stood accused of relying on old assumptions and drawing on the status quo when forced to take a position on drugs. I think this is where historians come in. My own work on cannabis control and consumption in Britain in the 20th century has demonstrated that the old assumptions about cannabis and the laws which established it as a police problem in the first instance date back to the 1920s and the imperial politics of the League of Nations, rather than any rational or scientific debate about the substance itself. Clearly, understanding why we have the laws and approaches that we do, and explaining how it is that the UK finds itself in the position that it does on cannabis, seems fundamental to me to testing how far these assumptions and this status quo rest on solid foundations. If they do not, and I think that my work goes some way to showing that they do not, then it is no longer safe to assume that the status quo is satisfactory. And this drives us on towards the open and honest debate, which the Royal Society of Edinburgh was calling for almost a decade ago. Yet it is not just within policy circles that cultural change has been called for. I was struck when reading the evaluation document published back in 2009 for the See Me campaign, the National Scottish Campaign against the stigma and discrimination associated with mental health, that what was sought was, and of course I always forget the slides, what was sought was the changes in expressed attitudes in Scotland towards people with mental health problems over the period 2002 to 2006. This looked to me like a significant cultural challenge, a project designed around cultural change. And yet the report was quick to admit that the approaches had all been drawn from the discipline of social marketing. And I'd be careful what I say about social marketing, seeing as the next speaker draws on expertise in social marketing, which is broadly understood as, the use of commercial marketing techniques to influence behavioural change for the social good. Now, this seemed to me rather like calling in the bakers when the car had to be fixed. No doubt social marketing is an important and useful set of techniques when selling a whole range of ideas and products. But is it really the correct toolbox to turn to when seeking to change cultures? My argument would be that it is not, and that changing cultures requires cultural technicians, those that have spent their lives creating new ideas, images or artefacts, and those that have devoted their careers to understanding the dynamics of these creative processes. In other words, those from the arts and humanities. To enable Scots to think in new ways about mental health, or indeed about alcohol use, or diet, or exercise, we need to embrace and understand the dynamics of cultural change. Those best placed to help us understand how we find ourselves facing our current challenges are historians. Those that are best placed to help us think in new ways about changing health cultures may well include writers, artists, performers and musicians, as they are the technicians of cultural change. Indeed, if we are to explore this idea of cultural change further, perhaps we can start tonight. If we use the language of the arts and humanities in place of more routine public health terms this evening, maybe we'll see matters in a new light. If binge drinking becomes chasing oblivion or fueling the passions, if risky sexual behaviour becomes seized by our animal lusts, if the use of cannabis becomes explaining inner worlds or seeking calm and comfort, then do we get nearer to the populations that we wish to engage with and the reasons that they engage in these behaviours and the reasons they find themselves insisting on taking these drugs, the reasons they are using food and bodies in risky ways? And does reformulating our objectives so that we now see the objectives of public health to be calming the passions or providing peace and comfort, does it help us to rethink our strategies? Well, I look forward to discussing this further this evening.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we can see our first debating point looming there, because our next speaker is Professor Gerard Hastings. He is the director of the Institute of Social Marketing. So I dare say that is what he will be addressing. Professor Hastings holds a PhD in social marketing from the University of Strathclyde. He's been appointed Professor of Social Marketing at Stirling, is Director of the Institute for Social Marketing and the Cancer Research, UK Centre for Tobacco Control Research. And his academic career began in 1980 at the University of Strathclyde, where he was appointed the first UK Professor of Social Marketing. So I think that gives us an indication of what Professor Hastings is going to be talking about.
Thank you very much indeed, Magnus, and thank you to the Royal Society for letting me come here tonight and talk to you, and thank you to all of you for coming out. I want to both disagree and agree with Jim. First of all, I will agree with him that we can and must learn from history. Partly I base that on the fact that I've been doing this since 1980, so I am history. But also I think, as the adage goes, if we don't learn from it, we're condemned to repeat it. Where I would disagree with him is the idea that we have to pick a discipline here, and certainly that we have to rely on a toolbox. I think we have to go a lot deeper than that if we're going to understand what's going on in public health. And the important word, I think, in public health is public. It's about people, and that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. But first of all, if we do a little bit of history, if we look at what the last 100 years of public health, maybe 120 years would be a fairer list, going back to when John Snow first took the handle off the pump in London. What have we learned? Certainly, if you look at the area of campaigning, what we have learned is that cigarettes kill you, sunshine kills you, telephones kill you, eating kills you, traffic kills you, digital games kill you, alcohol kills you, even the very act of procreation kills you. And we have, therefore, a basket of capricious threats that really just do no more or less than convince us that the best and most helpful thing we could do is just hide under the bed. Alternatively, I would put it to you, we can turn this history completely on its head. And we can argue that what we have learnt in the last 100 years is that there are many, many ways in which we now know we can do things that will make our lives healthier, happier, and longer. We are, ladies and gentlemen, living in the privileged area where, for the first time, we do know the secret of the elixir of life. No one in history has had this benefit before. We have it. The question, ladies and gentlemen, is how we can harness that, how we can leverage that, so that everybody can realise that they can benefit. They can improve their own lives. And it's not fair to look at Scotland and say, sick man of Europe, not getting anywhere, no progress. Absolutely not true. Smoking is disappearing to the extent that people are now looking at a time when tobacco use will be a matter of history. But if you look a bit closer, what's happening is that some sections of the population are moving a lot faster than others. Particularly, there's a social patterning to what is going on. What we have to understand is how we can get the poorer people in society to pick up on the idea that they can get into the driving seat of their own lives like the middle class people have done. That's our challenge. Again, taking some history, back in my first 10 years in Scotland, in fact, was spent pre-testing and evaluating public health mass media campaigns that were run by the then Scottish Health Education Group. Who can remember the Scottish Health Education Group? Anyone? Oh yeah. There's a few old people about. But what emerged from that, we tested all the sorts of campaigns I showed you at the beginning. One, don't drink, don't smoke, exercise, don't eat fatty foods. And what emerged from years and years of researching that, talking to the general public, was that they said, for God's sake, can't you get your act together here? Can't you see that, if you're continually telling us we're going to do ourselves harm, we're just going to get fed up and miserable and ignore you? Can't you tell us that if you're just bossy, we will rebel? Can you not be a bit more empathetic? Can you not recognise that we're not all of us going to spend all our time thinking about how we can prolong our lives by 10 years in 80 years' time? We want to think a little bit about the here and now, if you don't mind. Could you try helping us rather than telling us? Could you try to think of us not as a set of behaviours, but as people? For God's sake, they said. You talk about smoking, you're talking about drinking, you're talking about sex. That's just one Saturday night. Out of that emerged the idea that what we should be doing in Scotland is not continually patronising and lecturing people about ad hoc little bits of their lives and telling them off for not behaving as we, the people in white coats in Edinburgh, thought they ought to behave. What we should be doing is laying before them the potential of their lives. I think you'll agree it is at the very least a more hopeful way forward. But I'd argue more than that. It is much more than just hope. It is achievable. And what's happened with smoking rates across the UK, certainly in middle-class communities, is absolute evidence of that. Smoking will die out in many of our lifetimes. So let me just ask you a question for a moment. Just have a little think about this. Let's try and take this idea of being positive about thinking of the elixir of life, not the capricious threats. 3/4 of Scottish prisoners smoke. How might you use that sort of positive thinking, that sort of aspirational approach to encourage them to move in a healthy direction? And to help you think about that, let me turn to a world-famous prisoner and how he dealt with the same issue. Nelson Mandela, when he was in Robben Island, as leader of the resistance, took it upon himself to sit down with the new young men who were brought into the prison week after week and try to help them to adjust to a life that had suddenly changed dramatically for the worst. From being pumped up, young men out there fighting the enemy, throwing petrol bombs, they now found themselves in an oppressive regime on Robben Island. And he had to help them come to terms with this. And he did a lot of talking, and he helped them through a lot of issues. But amongst these many other issues, he dealt with tobacco. And he dealt with it very simply. Having thrown petrol bombs threatening them with cancer was not going to work. Far too wise, anyway, to attempt such a thing. He simply pointed out to them, he said, I notice some of you smoke. That's my agent, I'm busy. He said, I notice some of you smoke. I just want you to remind you that tobacco is a dependence-inducing substance. You will come to need it. Now, the guards know you will come to need it, and they will help you with your need. They will provide you with tobacco. But of course, they will want a return for their kindness. And sometimes, the need you have for tobacco will be small, and the favours you will have to do for it will be small. But sometimes the need will be big, and the favours you have to do will be big. That's all he said. Left it at that. I would suggest quite brilliant, because what he had managed to do was transform this into a boring, white-coated public health issue into one that absolutely knitted into their core values. He had aligned moving away from tobacco with moving away from apartheid. He couldn't have connected with them more effectively. Now, this is an anecdote. I have no RCT. I have no simulated Robben Island down the road where there was another Nelson Mandela that didn't tell this story. I cannot give you different prevalence of smoking rates between these two islands. But I will tell you another story that suggests that Mandela was right. Just a month ago, I was teaching in Nablus on the Palestinian West Bank about public health. And I told this story. At the end of it, the lecture, my host came up to me. He was a man about my age. And he said, thank you for the lecture, and thank you for the story about Nelson Mandela. And I am living proof that it works. During the first Intifada, I was fighting and I was arrested. I was put in prison by the Israeli army, and on my third day in prison, the guard came in and put 4 cigarettes down on my bunk and walked out. 4 cigarettes and no lighter. That is the day I gave up smoking. I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, that if we are going to succeed in taking the Scottish people forward to a time and a place where public health will really be all that it can be, where they can consume the genuine elixir of life the evidence base offers them, then we have to do as Mandela did. We have to enable them to become the heroes in their own stories. Thank you for listening.
One of the things that I was meant to read out at the beginning was, would you all please see that your mobile telephones are switched off? I now wish that I had read that out. I do apologize. Thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Phil Hanlon, and he is Professor of Public Health at the University of Glasgow. Beg your pardon. I've got it completely wrong. Is he... It is right, yes, it is right. I beg your pardon. I thought I was jumping a page there. Professor Hanlon was educated in the west of Scotland, graduated in medicine from Glasgow University, and following a period of clinical experience in adult medicine and general practice, he took up a research post with the Medical Research Council in the Gambia in West Africa, and on returning to the UK, completed a period of training in public health, after which he was appointed to the post of Director of Health Promotion for the Greater Glasgow Health Board. So he's right in the middle of it. And he's now Principal Investigator for the Culture and Wellbeing Study funded by the National Programme for Improving Mental Health and Wellbeing in Scotland, part of the Scottish Government's Mental Health Division. So, Professor Hanlon.
Lovely, thank you. Well, it's lovely to see you all. As the introduction shows, I've been a service public health person and I'm now an academic in public health. And you would expect, therefore, that I'm a fan and advocate of public health improvement. And to a degree I am. So I'm going to agree with part of what's been said. But I've also come to the conclusion that we're stuck. In fact, I actually once wrote a briefing paper for the Minister of Health, which was entitled "The Beginning of Wisdom is to Recognise that You're Stuffed." Not civil service language. But I think the beginning of wisdom in Scotland is to recognise why we're in such a difficult position as things currently stand. And to do that, and given that history is one of our themes, let's just go back and reinforce some of the things that we've talked of. So it's 1830 and it's the city of Glasgow, and life expectancy is 34 years. Life expectancy is not the only measure. People are miserable in all sorts of other ways. Levels of addiction, illegitimacy and violence are much higher than any of us would know. What's the reason for it? The reason for it is that the structure, the economic structure, the culture of that city, indeed of Scotland, is changing and changing rapidly. We've industrialised and people have been ripped off the land in Highland clearances and thrown into factories working up to 14 hours a day, and it's not good for their health. That's not a surprise, is it? Equally so, if you go to the individual level, they have an inner life and they have a biological life with behaviours. And these are problematical as well. All their certainties have been changed. Now, into that circumstance came a public health movement. Now, no one called themselves public health doctors or practitioners or social marketers, but they existed. These people started to improve life, not just in Glasgow, but in all the big industrial centres. And what I'm going to try and argue is that they did so by changing structure, culture, inner life for your sense of who you are, as well as biology and behaviour. And the fundamental error of today's approach is that we concentrate on one of those things, almost to the exclusion of the others. And indeed, the revolution that creates the eventual elixir of life and the movement from a life expectancy of 34 years to now a life expectancy of nearly 80 years began before that, because what I would fundamentally argue is that that improvement is a product of what, for better words, we'll call modernity. All the changes that we are now the beneficiaries of. Now, I think I'm going to argue in a moment that modernity is also the cause of most of the behavioural and social and cultural problems we have. But in case you feel that I'm down in modernity, I'll give you one phrase: anaesthetic dentistry. Yeah? That is just one of the kaleidoscope benefits that came. But the move to modernity didn't start in 1830, did it? Actually, we need to go much, much earlier than that. And the date I would go back to is the time when Galileo takes his story of how the Earth goes round the sun and not the other way, and he was put in prison for his faults, for his troubles. Why? Because he was seen to be attacking deep-seated ethical beliefs about the authority of the Bible, as well as deep-seated aesthetic beliefs about the geocentric universe, and going all the way back to Aristotle. So he puts forward a scientific truth, and he attacks ethical and aesthetic beliefs, and people resisted. But in doing so, and he was followed by William Harvey on the circulation of the blood through the heart, changing the nature of how people understood the heart. Yeah, the heart and stomach of a queen, says Queen Elizabeth I. Well, when you realised it was a pump, not something divinely ordained, you gave yourself permission to cut off the head of a king. So these things have got quite profound implications. So that sweep that moved towards modernity finds itself in a crucible of an industrializing city like Glasgow. Now, what did people do? Well, they did lots of different things. They did that top-down and bottom-up thing that Magnus spoke of. And it was the bringing, above all, of fresh water from Loch Katrine, the building of sewers, the creation of civic order, the ability to ticket, to put a ticket, the medical officer was empowered, of how many people could live in the overcrowded house. And that began, actually, it took 20 to 30 years before life expectancy. So there was no overnight effect. And of course there were campaigning parts of that. Even in the local street, people would police the bit in front of their shop, as well as the introduction of police forces, quite literally, to control civic disorder and the like. But health really began to improve when the social circumstances, the structural economic circumstances began to improve. When we really began to bring technical innovation to housing, to manufacture, to health, to hospitals, and all the rest of it. My little symbol of that is Jenner taking the virus of cowpox and working out you could protect smallpox from it. Now that's a technical fix, but it only happens in a culture that believes that that's a germ theory is acceptable, and it's not caused by something called miasma, or fate, or religion, or a curse, which would have prevailed only a few decades before. So the transformation comes as the structure of the economy changes and the society changes, as the culture changes, as the inner world and beliefs change, and as the biology changes, as people become stronger, more able, and so on. Now, by the next stage, or the end of that, I call it the appliance of science stage, when things were getting better, Scotland had a better life expectancy than almost any country in Europe. Better than countries like Austria, better than France. All that development in Scotland brought really great progress and advantage. So does public health work? Yes, it does. Absolutely and completely, when it's done like that. Now, the next phase was Beveridge, his 5 giants that had to be slain, and the introduction of the welfare state. In a sense, the social improvements up until that point had got better. And the point about TB is TB had been falling for nearly 80 years prior to the mass miniature radiography campaign. So yes, the campaign mopped up the problem, but the problem was largely defeated, if you take that military analogy. And it was defeated by these cultural and structural, as well as these individual changes. But at this point in the story, progress takes an interesting turn. And my source for this is a very interesting set of documentaries called The Century of the Mind by Adam Curtis. They're on YouTube and they're worth looking at. And he tells the story of American industrialists. I don't know, as students, you had that debate whether it's all a capitalist plot. I took the view the capitalists weren't bright enough, but Curtis showed me otherwise. And he interviewed these ancient Americans who were industrialists at the time of the Great Recession. And one of them had one of these voice boxes, you know, and he looked about 130 years old. And he said, by that stage, American factories were building and making much more stuff than people could consume. So we got in Bernays, okay? So Bernays is Freud's nephew. He's credited with having created advertising and public relations. And we said to Bernays, can you make people want things they don't really need? And Bernays says, sure. Yeah? And the example that Curtis shows is smoking. He persuaded Philip Morris and the other big American manufacturers that women were the target because most American men smoked by that stage. So what he did was that on Labor Day, in New York Parade, he persuaded a group of debutantes to dress up to the nines, to sequester cigarettes on themselves, and as they passed the press corps, ostentatiously take out cigarettes and light them. And he fed to the press corps the headline, "Torches of Freedom." Now you see what he's done? He's brought together, well, the Freudian bit is about penis envy, but we needn't go there, but female emancipation and glamour with cigarettes. And you can see the female smoking rates take off from that point. But that's not where it ends. The whole introduction of a consumerist, materialist, individualized, atomized society takes off from that period in history. Now, of course, in public health terms, the next big development was the National Health Service and Welfare State. So council housing, social security, old age pensions, free treatment. All these men who had hernias up until the health service and then got them repaired in the first year. A record number of hernia repairs in Scotland's history. Yeah? That made a difference to people's health and well-being. But by the time we reach the modern era, we have a different set of problems emerging. The scourges of the past, the choleras, are over. In the early part of this period, heart disease and cancer was a problem, although both of them are now declining quite substantially. And we end up with a series of what I would call diseases. Obesity, addictive behavior, loss of well-being, rising depression, and above all, inequalities in health. And I don't have time to go into this just now, but my fundamental argument, and if you want to follow the argument, Google the word "after now," all one string, and there's a website there with a massive information on it. The fundamental argument is this, that these modern diseases are emergent manifestations of late modernity itself. The inequality is built into the capitalist economy. And being at the bottom end of that hierarchy is bad for your health and well-being. Whitehall study shows it. It's not that there's a gap between the rich and the poor, it goes all the way down. And Britain has a particularly steep gradient. I got this aeroplane thing from a man called Ron Labonte, a Canadian health motor, and he always said at the end of this presentation, he says, remember, he says, shit rolls downhill. Yeah? Now, if that inequality is built into the system, built into the structure, and the cultural manifestations create an inner world, be all you can be is like pissing in the wind. It's better than, stop doing that or you'll die. Yeah, and I'm with you in doing it, Gerald. And I also think that we can reverse certain things. Smoking is the big example in the modern era of something, but it was a combination, of course, of taxation, warnings, all sorts of, as well as the social market dimensions that cause the smoking decline. So you need lots of different things. Can you do the same for obesity? When literally everyone in Scotland, only 5% of Scots are not currently putting on weight. You leave the average Scot to their own device for a year and they put on 2.2 pounds. That doesn't sound much, but in 10 years it's 22 pounds. And it's been going on inexorably for the past 20 years. And there's no sign of an end of it. Now, human beings, since the dawn of time, have managed to maintain calorie balance and an average weight. There's the odd fat person, but with no obesity epidemic. People didn't lose control 20 years ago. The culture and the structure has changed, and unless the culture and structure changes again, we are stuffed. So, I've got about 30 seconds left, I'm sure. How are we going to change this? Now, this is where you've got to take a leap of faith, okay? Because, and go and look at the website for the detailed argument. But the detailed argument is this, that just as the world changed from the pre-modern to the industrial, people moved from life expectancies of 34 to nearly 80, levels of well-being and opportunity and travel and so on that are unimaginable. And they did so when all four quadrants changed, when the structural, when the cultural, when the inner world and the biological world changed. So too we need to look for something as profound again. We need to look for a changed structure in an economy, and that will be driven by the price of oil, global warming, and other ecological pressures. We'll either go with the flow and do so in a productive way, or there will be a collapse. I can't predict when, but the evidence for that is irrefutable. Just as the people who ripped off their land and had to learn to be industrial workers and learn the Protestant work ethic and change their culture, so too a new culture will emerge in this world. So too will in a world, a new sense of what a human being is and why we're here and what motivates us. And all that stuff that Bernays did, which teaches you that social marketing works by giving people proximal. You would go and do your focus groups, and you'd find out that people don't want to hear these messages, and they're motivated by money, and they're this and they're that. Yes, they are, if they live in this culture and this circumstances. And there's very little way out of it. But that can change. Just as the inner world changed before, it can change again. And our biology will change. Our biology changed from hunter-gatherer world to the agricultural world, to the industrial world, and will change again. And who knows what levels of well-being are possible in that circumstance. Now, if you think that's utopian, I will close on this. I was in the Pyrenees last summer, and in one valley in the mountains, they described how during the Middle Ages, they had a war every summer with the next valley when the snows melted. Because they spoke a slightly different dialect and they were seen as the enemy. If you had gone in a time machine back to the Pyrenees and you said to the people in this valley, you know, there'll be a day when you'll all speak French and you'll voluntarily pay taxes so that the people in the next valley can go to school and have a health service. Would that have seemed utopian? Impossible? I think we should look for such transformation in Scotland as the next wave of public health improvement. Thank you.
Well, we have a debate, don't we? We have quite a confrontational debate looming, and we'll leave that to the panel discussion as those two apparently polarised views. Perhaps they're not as polarised as all that. But I'm now going to turn to my last speaker, who is Martin Raymond of Cloudline PR. Martin was named as one of the top 4 most influential marketers of the last 21 years. Before setting up Cloudline in 2005, he was head of public affairs at NHS Health Scotland, best known for his work with HEBS, including the iconic Think About It campaign, and that work won many awards, including IPA Effectiveness Awards, and he's been PR Week's UK PR Professional of the Year and indeed Client of the Decade in Scotland. Broadcaster on a variety of topics, formerly chairman of Young Scots, been a consultant to the World Health Organization, guest lecturer at many Scottish universities. So I'm delighted to ask Martin Raymond to be our 4th and final speaker.
Scotland, by Alistair Reid. It was a day peculiar to this piece of the planet, when larks rose in long, thin strings of singing, and the air shifted with the shimmer of actual angels. Greenness entered the body. The grasses shivered with presences, and sunlight stayed like a halo on hair and heather and hills. Walking into town, I saw, in a radiant raincoat, the woman from the fish shop. "What a day it is!" I cried, like a sunstruck madman. And what did she have to say for it? Her brow grew bleak. Her ancestors raged in their graves as she spoke with their ancient misery. "We'll pay for it. We'll pay for it. We'll pay for it." Now, I should have at this point a fantastic slide, which I will switch to as a piece of background. I hear you think, What on earth has that piece of poetry got to do with the topic? What on earth has it got to do with advertising? What on earth has it got to do with health and with how we help people to change their health behaviours? The task this evening, for all of us, because you're about to start doing some work on this as well as us very shortly. The task this evening is to look at the history and the future of health behaviours, and how we help people, how we work with people on that. And I've been in this process for many, many years. As Gerard said, there's a kind of landmark in your life when you're suddenly invited along to something to talk about the history of it. You do believe that you've kind of passed a certain stage in your career at this point. And I have worked through the whole evolution of this business. I've worked through health education, its evolution into health promotion, into health improvement, into social marketing. And what I want to do this evening is really just two things. One is to try and speculate a little on what we might have learned, what I might have learned, heavens above, from that 20 years experience. But I also want to speculate on the other area of our discussion this evening, which is about the arts and the humanities. And I don't want to decry the humanities, which is a wide discipline in itself. But I want to look specifically at the arts and what the arts in Scotland might have to offer us. But first of all, I feel I should give you an advert. Well, it is a piece of advertising from the olden days, from the 1990s, which is certainly the olden days, even for me. A classic piece of health communication, targeting young people, targeting very specifically 11 to 14, 15-year-olds in the transition period between primary and secondary school, with a bias towards young women, because that was certainly at that time, and still now, the area where there was the greatest concern about smoking prevalence levels. A piece of work that set out to tackle the culture, to question the culture. As Gerard said, not telling people about the long-term effects on their health of smoking, but looking at the short-term effects. And doing it in what at the time I think I could safely say without fear of contradiction, because you all look like quite a young audience here, but without fear of contradiction, was at the state of the art in terms of health communications. And the outcomes here, I won't bore you with that, I don't have time to go through them all. But the song became a played item on the radio. Young people embraced it. I speak to lots of students who are in the kind of 18 to 25 age range, and if they were brought up in Scotland, they all know this. To me, campaigns of this type are what I would call the lubrication. If there's a top model, a top-down model, and a bottom-up model, somewhere in between, there's ways of setting the agenda. There's ways of getting people to think about things in a slightly different way. There's ways of creating discussion. And in 1999, 2000, the way to do it was using television with a huge audience. Now, the way to do that now is probably not television. And I can't show you the actual page here. I know this is very small. I know this is the back. I'll read out the important parts. And by the way, the point I'd like to make is any spelling errors in this are because I took this verbatim from YouTube. Here is YouTube, where Stinks, that particular advert, enjoys a second life, literally a second life. And the small print up at the top there, there's 225, nearly 226,000 views of stinks. There are 162 textural comments on that page. There's one video response as well, which is quite entertaining. I recommend it to you. Here we are, completely different technology. 10 years later, more than 10 years later. And what you get on this site, I find fascinating, because some of it is nostalgia. Some of it is young people have reached the point where they become nostalgic about their childhood, as you do. But even more interesting is exactly the type of debates. From as far as I can make out, young people have exactly the same target age range as there was 10 years ago. The issues about whether girls who smoke are attractive or not attractive, whether you think that's the case or not, whether this is a convincing argument that's in that piece of advertising, or whether it's not a convincing piece of advertising, doesn't matter. That wasn't the point. That wasn't the point of what we were trying to do with this. The point was, let's get some debate about this. Let's question some of the culture in young people's culture that exists around smoking. Because young people don't smoke cigarettes because they want to smoke cigarettes. Young people smoke cigarettes because they're a quick way to sophistication, looking older, being attractive to members of the opposite sex, being part of a group. And if we don't use the tools that we have available, whether it's YouTube or whether it's mass media television with huge audiences as it was at that time in 1999, then they will pick these messages up from somewhere else. And we should at least be part of that debate. There's a very kind of simple thing in advertising, because I have to say, I should have said this right at the beginning, I am the wicked capitalist here this evening, okay? I'm the small business owner, and I've worked in the public sector and I've worked in the private sector. And I see this very much from two different camps. And if you can have a foot in both camps that are very wide apart sometimes, I've certainly got a foot in both of these camps. But it's said in advertising, advertising is not about doing things to people. Advertising is about what people do to advertising and do to advertising messages, and how they use it, and how they consume it, and how they debate it, and how they discuss it. And my argument is that it is important to look to the future, and structures and underlying structures are absolutely vital. Of course they are. Absolutely vital. But we have the system we have currently, and we should use that system, and we should use the tools that are available within that system to encourage debate and to encourage discussion. Now, you asked the question, I know, you're sitting there thinking, well, what was the effect of that? That's quite interesting. A bit of debate, bit of discussion. Did anything come of that? Well, I don't know if it did. But I do have one piece of factual information which I give you, which is in 2007, when Scotland introduced legislation banning smoking in public places. Around about 79% of adults in Scotland said that they were proud to live in Scotland, the country that had banned smoking first. And 84%, not much more, but a little more, of young people said that they were proud to live in the country that had banned smoking. Now, I think most people would have guessed that that would not have been the case, that young people would have been rebellious, they would have been hostile to the whole idea of legislation which controlled their behaviour, and yet they were the most enthusiastic and most encouraging. Now, I'm not saying for a second, I see quickly here, because this is a very academic audience, I'm not for a second suggesting a causal impact between one piece of advertising and that outcome in terms of support for smoking legislation amongst young people in Scotland. But what I am suggesting is that that suggests that there might have been a shift in culture, and a shift in culture amongst young people in the way that they regarded smoking and cigarettes, not just due to that one piece of advertising, but due to a cumulative effect of messages over a much longer period of time. I have a slight byline here, which I just going to throw this in here as well, just to stimulate the audience just a little bit more, because I'm going to put a word in here for the tabloid newspapers of this nation. Yes, I see you already going, oh yes, I'd like to see you try and defend tabloid newspapers. All I want to say here is that the other point I think of significance around the introduction of legislation around smoking in Scotland in 2007 was the fact that one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the new legislation was the Sun newspaper, whose target audience, whose demographic in my language, is young working class men, who supported this introduction. Now, I'd worked in PR and communications and in the health field for many, many years before 2007. We were the health police. We were the enemy as far as the Sun were concerned. And it took years and years of work with journalists, with the evidence, with challenging thinking, to bring a newspaper like that round. Now, you can dismiss the media and you can say it has no real influence on people and media is declining and we're all online. No, we're not. One of the busiest websites in Britain is the Sun website. It's still a brand that's important. It's still important for people. And that support, I think, is absolutely vital. And we neglect the media if we want to debate health at our peril. So what have I learned? I've learned very obvious things, I think, which I'll skip quickly. Technology changes, but the content is constantly important. What you say and how you stimulate people is absolutely vital. You can let people generate their own content now. That's not a problem. But what's the agenda? What do you want? Do you want to encourage people to think about things, to look at things in different ways? To, as Phil suggests, overturn accepted ideas and accepted ways of looking at things, which are quite profoundly accepted by people. I've learned to listen, and I've learned that it's all about dialogue. That all makes sense. But I've also learned something about respect. I sat in lots of meetings. The trouble with any health campaigns is that, generally speaking, you're talking to people who are younger, and you're talking about people who are poorer than you are. And sometimes in those meetings, it was hard to see that there was much respect for the people that you were talking to. And this is where I want to start to introduce the whole concept of what the arts can offer us. Because I don't mean respect like a Down with the Kids rapper or anything like that. I mean respect in terms of understanding people, their predicaments, the situation that they're in. And I would see the best way of understanding and the best presentation is that of artists. And as a few of them, they are artists that I think have captured something about Scotland. Gregory Burke and Bill Forsyth, James Kelman, John Byrne. These are people who can give us real insights, give real understanding about what health means to people and what people's lives are like. Not uncritical, but important insights. And the last two things there, whether this is a rational process or not that we're engaged in, because we're very rational people. I give you David Hume, who lived around the corner here, in fact, just at the end of this block, I suppose, once upon a time. And his very famous statement, reason is not only to be the slave of the passions. I always think this is astonishing that a Scotsman said this. I'm always amazed by this. It's astonishing in the same way that Robert Louis Stevenson ended his days in Samoa. It just seems very odd for us Scots to say this. But how true? It's all about people and their passions. It's all about what drives people. The non-rational can cover many different things. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go into all of these in detail. The image is as important as content. That joining in, that people are not individuals. They change their health behaviours because other people are changing their health behaviours. I could take you into the whole modern and much derided, let me tell you, because of its association with the current government, into the whole science and art of behavioural psychology and behavioural economics, which looks at this whole question of joining in, that people change the behaviour because they see other people changing the behaviour, therefore it must be a good thing. And that's because we're herd animals and we work better in large groups than we do as individuals. But we neglect that whole concept of joining in at our peril. Communities are important. There's online communities. It's not just the street you live in. It's not just the place you work. We need to look at communities. And I put in here glamour and aspiration. Because the thing I think that's killed the best intentions of health communication over many years is its sheer worthiness. Its sheer inability to see humour in what it's trying to do. Its sheer inability to see the absurdity of a lot of what it tries to do. Finally, I think the key is culture. And this brings me back round to my opening poem. The culture of Scotland, as Phil's work will testify, the culture of Scotland has got huge impact on our health. We have to understand that culture, and we have to challenge that culture. And I believe that the way to do that is not through statistics, it's not through social marketing, but through our artists, through our writers. The story of that poem I read, Scotland, by Alistair Reid, is an interesting one, because some of you may know this, that Alistair Reid, quite recently, ceremoniously burned the poem at St Andrew's Poetry Festival. He burned it because he felt that we didn't need the poem anymore. That Scotland's culture had shifted and changed so much in the last few years that fatalism, that darkness, was no longer part of our culture. The very fact he did that, the very fact that I would disagree almost entirely with his burning of the poem, because I think we need that poem more than ever, shows the power of art. And that fatalism and that darkness, to me, is one of the things which powers and underlies our continuing problem with health. I think we should, particularly this evening, when we've got such an open brief, look to the future and imagine the future, and imagine different structures in the future. But we won't be there, maybe not in terms of the timescales of the Middle Ages till now, but we won't be there for a few years. And in the meantime, I think we should use the tools that we have available, and they're very powerful tools. And I think we should use them wisely, and we should use them carefully before other people do. I thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. What an absolutely fascinating series of points emerging there. And what I'm going to do is ask the speakers if they would come up and sit here on the platform, and we can pick up some of those themes and some of those questions and perhaps pursue them a little bit further, because I think the one thing that there were lots of points of quite fundamental disagreement, but one of the points that seems to run through what all four speakers were saying was the need to tackle, change, improve, develop, in some way alter this culture. And that culture is, some speakers said, is changing and has changed dramatically, and that the Scotland of today is very different from the Scotland of, say, 50 years ago. But equally, there are pockets which clearly have not. And although that, what one might describe, one speaker describes the dark face of Scotland has been rejected by a large section of the population, there are clearly pockets where all the worst incidences of our health reside, and which seem not only to be immune to that change and that improvement, but almost positively resist it. There's almost a feeling, and maybe I'm mistaken in this, and perhaps I hope can be corrected, but nevertheless a sense that the more those messages are transmitted, the more almost there's a kind of rebellious streak at the heart of those sections of society which say, well, we hear all you say about improving and about our health and about our diet and about turning our back on drinking and smoking, etc., but we sort of put two fingers up to you and we are going to carry on. And I think that's if we're talking about cultural change, I think that's what I'd like to focus on. So maybe we can look at the immediate task ahead. Do we, as Professor Hanlon sort of suggested, almost wait for this cultural change for the valleys in the Pyrenees, who over rather a long period of time, I think it was about 1,000 years, was it took them to start paying each other's taxes. We haven't got quite that amount of time. Do we wait for this cultural change to take place? and hope that it will, or do we force it? And if we force it, how do we force it? I think it's
One
up to
small
you.
point of clarification. I'm not arguing that we wait, for sure. I'm arguing that, I was just using that as an analogy. I think the more important picture I was trying to paint was imagining yourself in an industrial city in 1830. And what you did was you worked to the creation of an ordered, prosperous industrial city with a new culture, a new inner life, new biological realities and new behavioural realities. And that is what transformed us into Gerard's elixir of life. And what I'm saying is that the dis-eases are the product of our consumerist, individualised life that began with Bernays and those movements at that time. And to use the tools of the devil with much less money to try and fight back just strikes me as useful at the margins, and I'm happy to go with all of that. But the real public health challenge is the creation of a post-industrial society with less inequality. While the inequality is run like that, persuading people at the bottom end of your spectrum isn't at the heart of the problem. Until we can work towards these communities being re-engaged in work and activity, whether that's through the green economy or whatever, then it's not going to happen.
That, may I say, is all very well, but that's not going to solve the problem overnight. There's no solving the problem overnight, but surely we need a shorter-term solution than that.
We do. I think, first of all, I think there's quite a few false dichotomies being thrown around tonight. And we've got another one in front of us here. Do we wait or do we force people? I don't think we do either of those. We can work with people, not force them. But to pick up Phil's argument specifically, he says we don't want to use the tools of the devil against the devil. I think we do. I think Martin was right. I think there's a lot we can do, and HEBS is a great example of that, where very small budgets can have a very big impact. But we can do more than just use it to seduce young people one way or t'other. We can do as the devil does, Philip Morris, Imperial Tobacco. They have tried to influence governments to suit them. So they formed links with the armed services. They tried to change gender issues through their marketing. So we can, in public health, do things to devalue, degrade, and destroy things like the tobacco industry. And that is happening. I think even now we have a government in London who is very, very pro-business. But even they will not do deals with the tobacco industry. Now, that's an enormous step forward. So what I would suggest to Phil is it's not just a matter of do we pooter around with teenagers as the tobacco industry does. No, we do what exactly the tobacco industry does. We do some of that, but we also do our competitive analysis and work out where we have people pushing in precisely the wrong direction and use all our skills, all our persuasive abilities to make sure that they are constrained and stopped. And the tobacco industry is a fantastic example of that. No advertising, very limited how they can sell their products. They're even now talking about stripping their logos from their packages. These are enormous steps forward. And so much so that, as I say, the BMA, Department of Health, are now actively talking about a time when smoking is a thing of the past. That is a great step forward. Yes, I agree. We want the nirvana to approach us a bit faster than it might, but if we wait for that, then a lot of people will die in the meantime.
James Mills, I just want to stick with this subject of smoking, because what almost all of you agreed on was that the big event that changed attitudes to smoking was the smoking ban. And that is an example of a government using legislation to force through a ban, which is a top-down approach and which you all agree was very successful. Shouldn't we do more of that?
Again, I think understanding the phenomenon of smoking and the decline of smoking in the West is in many ways more complicated than that, because Virginia Berridge, who is a public health historian down in London, recently observed that at the same time as the smoking of tobacco has declined, certainly amongst younger populations, the smoking of cannabis has grown. And again, I think we need to be careful not to separate out any one phenomenon from the others, because often we find, certainly with intoxicants, that these are constantly shifting but interrelated markets. So as people stop using tobacco, they may well be using other things which we view to be equally as problematic. So yes, I think we need to rightly celebrate the decline of the market for tobacco products, but we need to be careful to keep an eye on the larger picture.
And
well, I think my caveat to the whole question of introduction of legislation around smoking would be that we might have had a different view of it if people had routinely flouted the law, if the law had been ignored in some parts of the country, and there had been a conflict around that debate and around that legislation. And the fact that there wasn't seems to me to suggest something about how the argument in people's minds had been won about smoking, and that the whole question of which the Sun might have argued of people's freedom to damage their own health if they wanted to, whether it was in clubs, so they were all together, so they all agreed. That showed some kind of shift in a culture, and a culture around health. My other point would be that there's journalists in the room here, and my sense in Scotland over a period of time which maybe ran through the late 1990s into the early thousands, maybe the early days of the Scottish Parliament, health and public health was one of the very top topics at that time. Not questions about expenditure on the health service and on hospitals, which is always a big topic, but the questions and fundamental questions, and this is where I think between here and the revolution, there's lots of steps. And if you start to debate the whole issue about poverty and inequalities and health, and that debate is open and is informed and is sustained over such a long period of time, then you will start to get changes. Politicians will take heed of that and will start to look at issues. And the whole question of whether you legislated on smoking in public places in Scotland was supported by nervous politicians because they had a sense that the argument had been won and that they could get kudos from that. So I think the use of tools, and it could be tools like PR as well as advertising, are absolutely vital in working towards these bigger questions and bigger changes.
I'm just going to resist asking Professor Hanlon to comment on that, because it's your opportunity now to ask questions. And if you would keep your questions quite short, identify yourself and wait for a microphone to reach you before you ask it. Gentleman over here.
Thank you. I must go, I'm very sorry, but I just want to make this point. I met somebody who had given up working for Rhodesian tobacco about 40 years ago, and I said, why? He said, I couldn't go on working for that sort of firm with all its cancer connections and so forth. I gave up. I told everybody else at the time that I could tell, and nearly every single one has died of cancer. Because they said, oh, it won't happen to me. Hopeless.
Right, we'll take another question from here, from the gentleman here.
Hi, my name's Chris Fremantle. I found the presentation has been really interesting for me because I work in the arts, and one of the key challenges I find is between the position from a fine art perspective and the position from a design perspective. And the design perspective is very often still focused on problem solving. And I'm very conscious that you see amongst some artist practices that they describe that actually one has to work out what the story is before one tackles the problem. And it seemed to me that in a sense that James at the beginning not only demonstrated that, but he also demonstrated the need for a real critical edge in that, in drawing that line back to cannabis policy and the League of Nations and the political issue there, and that actually this reframing, in effect, the really important reframing of the issues, not just tackling them as a problem, saying smoking is a problem, what are the techniques that we can tackle smoking, but the big reframing of whether it's the critique that allows you to see cannabis as a political issue, not a health issue, or that climate change might be actually the big driver for changing public health, seems to me really fundamentally interesting in what's been going on this evening. So I'm sorry, I can really only comment at this stage, but that was what I wanted to say.
Yep, good comment. Anybody else, stick your hand up if you've got a burning question. Otherwise, I'll ask the panel to respond. One in the middle there.
I'm a card-carrying capitalist. I smoke, I drink, I love life, and I don't want it to last forever.
Right, well, there you are. I think we need to seek the panel's advice on that particular issue, because, after all, that's what it's all about.
Yep. I think this is part of the reason why the arts and the humanities have an interesting role to play in all this, because, of course, artists, take your choice, Baudelaire, Yeats, Morrison, Pete Doherty, I noticed is back to prison this week. They've raised the possibility that many of these behaviours deemed risky by public health professionals, by governments and so on, are desirable and enjoyable, and draw our attention to the reasons why people indulge in behaviours classified as risky by others than themselves. So again, I think this is where the arts will be important in the future in framing public health engagement, in actually fundamentally asking questions about what are the behaviours that we should be seeking to eradicate from societies, and why, if individuals like the gentleman who spoke there last are happy smoking and drinking, why stop him? Why prevent him from doing this? And again, I think it's we begin to return to the language of poets and literature and music to really begin to understand why people enjoy doing these things.
I get the impression that that particular gentleman, however, is perfectly aware of what he's doing, and he is perfectly aware that it may not be the healthiest of lifestyles and will take his own decision. We're talking about a broader issue, aren't we, about a culture, a shifting of an entrenched culture.
Yes, the word entrenched is always interesting, because very often in these debates, the Scotland's love affair with drink, for example, is put down to the fact that we have a culture in Northern Europe of drinking very heavily. But culture changes, and it changes remarkably fast. And tobacco, we've already witnessed, has changed that way. Drink has changed dramatically in my lifetime. When I was a young man, you drank to prove you could stay sober. You now drink to seek oblivion, to see what losing control is like. That is an enormous change. Now, the point I would make of our colleague who said he loves life but doesn't want to live too long, and is clearly doing exactly the right thing to bring that to pass, is that none of these things are accidental. The fact that we associate drinking with having a good time has not come about by chance. If you look at the population of the world as a whole, most adults are teetotal. It's just that we happen to live in a culture where drinking is very, very normal, and we have an industry that spends £800 million a year convincing us that that is the case. So it's very difficult for us to see a champagne cork flying out of a bottle without thinking somebody's celebrating something. But that's not natural, God-given reality. That's been carefully manufactured, just as Phil's story of the emancipation of women through cigarettes. That's not an accident. That's been very carefully planned. So I would just ask you to look critically at what's going on around you. And is smoking a cigarette really the best way you can get the most out of life? No. Well, try. Well, my message to you then will be an aspirational one. Find the best way.
I think this is a perfect illustration of exactly what we're talking about. While we live in an individualised, consumerised, materialist culture, that's a perfectly legitimate and acceptable position. And none of us have any right to criticise you or you us, and that's the way we live. Okay? But we live in a world which is heading towards an ecological crisis, at the very least, a financial crisis that is very real, with expanding inequality, and unless we can develop an ethic between ourselves, which develops, that's the point of the story about caring for people in the next valley. Now, as long as you only care about yourself, then, and as long as you don't care that, and if the point about it is that there will be if you're typical, because it's not right to personalise it, let's just make it more generalised. Yeah? In Scotland, healthy life expectancy stops about 23 years before people die. So although people sometimes say they don't care if they die early, most people care about living 20 to 30 years with a chronic illness and all that goes along with it. And what's more, as a society, we care about the burden of that on each other and on family structures and all the rest of it. So there's an ethical and aesthetic as well as a scientific and a moral and a civics question in all of this. And, you know, I think that a society that is so individualized and so respecting of I'll do what I want needs to be balanced by one that takes up these issues. I don't know how to do that because I want individual rights to be respected as well.
You don't know how to do it? My goodness, we're in trouble then. At the back there was one more, and we'll just have to wind it up. I think we've got a couple of minutes.
I wonder if the balance might be achieved by perhaps financial consideration. I'm a card-carrying cancer surgeon, and I wonder if my hedonist individual in the audience here might wish to perhaps equate his value with his hedonistic behaviour with the value of the burden of his care. Clearly, when he's dead, he'll cost us very little. But whilst he remains alive and engaging in such behaviour, he remains a risk and a cost to us all.
One part. Yeah, but I think there's a risk here that we're seeing the use of intoxicants to soothe pain, to make life a bit more interesting, to find the company around one slightly more stimulating. This isn't a recent historical development. We can look at societies right back to the beginnings of human civilization and find evidence of the use of a range of intoxicants, as I say, to ease pain or to dull the rigours of labour or to make life seem more interesting, and the use of psychoactives in order to explore the full range of human possibilities. So I think there's a danger here that we're focusing in on our particular society here in trying to formulate intoxicants as a specifically modern drugs problem.
Well, for the sake of clarity, I mean, all societies have used mind-altering substances, and all will, and usually in combination, and usually for pleasurable purposes. No one's objecting to that, really they aren't. But in Scotland, we've seen a fourfold increase in alcohol-related deaths in the last 23 years amongst men. And, you know, that's a problem. And that's why we're concerned about it.
And by the way, I've been out drinking with Gerard, I have to say this, and that thing about holding his drink, he lies about.
Okay, well, there you are. I think that's a very, very good note on which to embark on your breakout sessions. Please go, and would you please be back here by 8:15 so that we can have our summaries. Haven't slipped too much, which I'm very pleased about. And what I'm now going to do is just ask each group just to please the leader or spokesperson of each group to stand up and just give us a summary of where their discussion led them. And we're going to start with Group 1, the one that was in Welcome East, to kick off. And perhaps you'd identify yourself when you... Is there a microphone? Oh, come to the lectern, right.
Okay, so I frantically took notes and I'm going to try and put them all together for you very briefly. So our questions, which you can see on your piece of paper, I'm not going to repeat them to you, but we had a discussion about the belief that arts can shed light on how government spends money and how they solve larger social issues. The current linear problem solving doesn't work, so cultural change is needed, and we very much discussed that. The NHS do what they can do, but society is the greater entity, and that's what needs to change, and that's the cultural aspect of it. Complementary medicine has a large benefit, as do the arts, but this is, although the NHS acknowledge it, it's not necessarily directly funded by them. along with that goes the fact that nurses and doctors see everything as science, and maybe it would be beneficial if they gain an insight from the outside world and draw it into their practice. We had a discussion about literature and art and imaginative representation, so how art represents the health. Ill health is actual, people are living it, but artists represent ill health through artistic representation, and it would be interesting to have the dialogue between those two areas. And we also had a discussion about theatre and how this can be used as a tool to communicate and stimulate discussion, but it has to be good, and it can't be propaganda, so that it sinks in and it gets discussion going. So it goes back to that thing about dialogue. We also covered the psychology of targeting what people like, so more positive advertising. We had a discussion about how it might be the way forward. Does the brutal approach shut people off? Maybe it's about building a bridge for dialogue to develop, instead of arts embedding themselves within NHS practice, which we covered how maybe that would shut down an artist. They have the opportunity to build a bridge, and with that bridge comes a dialogue, and from that things can grow. And that's pretty much everything, if that's
Very
okay
good.
for time. Thank you.
Very good. Excellent. Fine. Thank you very much. And now I'll call on Group 2 from the ones from Welcome West, which is the top end.
Okay, thank you. So our group discussed that many of us have behaviors that we would like to change, and we know people in our lives that have behaviors that they would like to change, but for one reason or another that they can't. We all face obstacles, two of which we really discussed were changing perceptions, and that how we think about things really does make a difference. Right now, smoking has become stigmatized, whereas alcohol consumption is and remains socially acceptable for certain age groups, which also leads to the realization that these concerns are not necessarily blanket cultural issues, and that we have to address them each individually. Another obstacle that we discussed was that there are economic obstacles, economic factors that may hinder us from being able to make the changes that we'd like. In order to try to combat these changes, we came up with the idea that one of the best things to try to do is to find positive, easy, healthier, and cost-effective alternatives to what these behaviors are. For instance, we discussed electronic cigarettes and how that may help in reducing tobacco use, but also things like encouraging the larger grocery stores into neighborhoods of lower socioeconomic status, so that you have the fresh produce and things rather than the convenient ready-made foods and things like that. So in doing this, to sort of try to counter the contradiction of availability compared to the things that we try to discourage. So whereas we discourage smoking, and yet you can buy cigarettes at any convenience store. In doing this, to offer these positive alternatives would help us to more easily make the transition to make change.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And now Group 3, that was Welcome West at the bottom end.
Hello. So again, we had two questions, and we reversed them. So we've got less to say about the first question, but that was about the idea that we are in a process of change, an age of change now. And I think everybody agreed that we are in an age of change, but somebody pointed out that there are different scales to that change. There are short-term goals and there are long-term goals, or short-term changes and long-term changes. And that ultimately, somebody remarked that really climate change is potentially such a big issue for us. Energy is such a big issue that issues like smoking and obesity are probably going to be the last of our worries, come 50 years' time. And then the question about how humanities and arts, what kind of input they can have. And we started off with the observation that public health should be there to inform, to give out good information. If that's what they do best, then that's what they should stick with. But my colleague later argued, actually later than that, really what we should be taking is a cross-disciplinary approach to this. No one object, no one strategy is going to work here. And that communication is a two-way thing. It's not a single way. It's not you don't put out information and expect it to be absorbed. And then somebody raised the issue of cognitive dissonance. That if you've already invested in a behaviour, then telling people that behaviour is bad for them is not going to work. It's a natural human reaction to reject that information if there's an imbalance in your mind. And that messages only really work, or that health input only really works if you have access to the tools of change. If you don't believe that you can change, or you don't have access to those tools, then change is incredibly difficult, and perhaps for a lot of people it's not something they can even imagine that they can do. And somebody else made the observation that, of course, arts already work in health very extensively, whether that's working with stroke patients, mental health. And then we looked at whether, just generally, rather than focusing on disease like that, whether arts and humanity could have a role in that process of changing our attitudes and reframing our attitudes to health, or the questions, the public health questions. And we raised the idea that that telling people who are involved in the arts and humanities that they need to put over a message is not going to work. They're people with their own brains. They have their own sort of reactive processes. And so really their job is to open up discussion. As a nation, the Scottish Arts and Humanities is to open up discussion and then to be tackling some of those core underlying themes of health inequalities in Scotland, which is social inequalities and alienation. And somebody at the end raised the issue of responsible journalism. And I think we've all seen irresponsible journalism and the devastating effects that can have, whether that's on people's basic trust in nutritional information that's coming out, or nice guidelines, nice decisions. And that's where we ended.
Thank you. And finally, Group 4, you were in the Scott room.
We had a very interesting debate. We first of all started off with the second question first, because that was we felt really the underlying basis to get to the first question. We opened up with the debate really of individualism versus family culture, and also how personal stories affected us in terms of whether people smoked, didn't smoke, or didn't drink. The case for individualism and hedonistic seemed to be stemmed around that people are very much individualised, and because they don't have the family restraints around them, it gives them access to be much more hedonistic. But with family restraints imposed, not imposed in an awful way, but through maybe an example of Southern Europe, where they have food and wine and nothing's done to extremes, that this is the family structure, and it helps to encapsulate a reasonably healthy lifestyle as opposed to individualistic, hedonistic ways. And on that basis, there was other examples of stories of someone brought up that it's when their child said, "Why, Dad, when you're smoking, you're going to end up like that person there when they're 80 with lung cancer." That was the catalyst to stop them smoking. There were other issues brought up that were on that debate, where people will say, "Oh, well, I know someone who's 100 and smokes and is quite healthy." there's other restraints that also do we bring in prohibition to endorse a healthier lifestyle. And the ever-shifting cultural changes now in southern Europe where universities are particularly worried about binge drinking. It would seem that if we want to tackle health issues, we really have to tackle education at a very young age, so that when children see their peers and their parents behaving in a bad way, they'll be able to identify that this is not the way to go, because they'll be educated to a standard where they start to question that lifestyle. I think it's a common agreement that the media is and can be used as a positive force to healthier Scotland. Thank you.
All four groups throwing out very, very interesting and important points, which all, I think, are directed to how we change this culture, how we bridge the gap between the healthy eaters and the unhealthy section of our society. I'm going to ask, just because we've got this wonderful body of expertise on the platform, just before we go, I'm going to ask each one of them just to give us his kind of perceptions of our discussion and a message to go away with. So I'm going to start, Dr. Mills, with you, please.
Thanks, Magnus. I think what I've heard here today is a general agreement that cultural change is at the heart of future strategies and future approaches to public health issues and problems in Scotland. And I think I've also heard that there's general agreement that the arts and humanities are well equipped. Their business is cultural change, so they are well equipped to contribute to solving these problems. I think what I also heard in the discussion group was some examples of where this is already happening. And I think that the challenge for the arts and humanities into the future is to make sure that we do this more often and more effectively.
Very good. Professor Hastings.
Very similar line I would take, actually. I think it's been a very stimulating discussion. There's a lot of complexity, a lot of difficult challenges ahead of us. But what above all is clear for me is that we can do something about this. For the first time in history, I think, we are in a position to do something about this. So I would leave you with the idea of can do. And let me wrap that up in a story about smoke-free, which we've invoked many times this evening. Jack McConnell was dead set against going for smoke-free legislation. And his mind was changed. His mind was changed over one weekend. He flew out of Scotland to visit Dublin on the Friday evening, and he came back on the Monday morning, left on Friday saying no, came back on the Monday morning saying yes. And what had happened in the intervening weekend is that he had met with Michael Martin, the Minister of Health in Dublin, who had shepherded in smoke-free in Ireland already. And they had their formal meetings and so on, but on the Saturday evening they slipped their minders and they sat down informally and talked to each other, man to man, politician to politician. And at one point in that conversation, Jack McConnell asked Michael Martin, "Tell me, Michael, if you had your time over again, would you do anything different?" And Michael Martin's answer, I think, should be in our ears tonight. Michael Martin simply said, yes. I would have done more sooner. We too should do more sooner.
Very good. Martin Raymond.
Well, it's either an indictment or a triumph of the Scottish Parliament. The introduction of that smoking ban and that decision that was made is probably its single greatest achievement over 2 and starting 3 terms. I have got a huge amount. I thought every time I come to something like this, I think, well, I know everything about this. I've done it all before. I've done it for 20 years. I've learned a huge amount. I suppose that's the first thing to say this evening. And the debate has been really, really interesting. I think the long term is important. I think we should always keep our eye on the long-term goals. But when your trousers are on fire, sometimes it's quite difficult to keep your eye on the long-term goals, and we have to look at the short term. I'm convinced that media and the media that we have has such a huge influence, we almost take it for granted. We almost deny the fact that it has an influence on us as intelligent, articulate beings. But it does. And it's either an influence for good, or it's an influence for bad. But it's certainly an influence. I don't know about bringing the humanities to the work. Bringing arts and humanities to understanding human beings seems to me to make a lot of sense. But so too is bringing humanity and understanding that we're talking about individuals and people. And it's very easy for us to start to talk abstractly about problems and behaviours. In the end of the day, it's human beings. And if we don't understand that, then we'll still fail to do much about this area.
Thank you. And Professor Hanlon.
Thank you. I've learned one thing tonight, and it is that there's a danger in presenting the story that I presented, that it creates a false dichotomy between this short and long term. So I would embrace the short and the immediate and the social marketing campaign that can be done, and we can learn and do that. But at the same time, I think we need the artists and the playwrights and the cinematographers and the others to paint a picture of a not too distant future where we use less stuff but have more time, where we have learnt to grow stuff more locally, make stuff and re-engage communities that have been unemployed for 3 generations, because that will make a difference in the way that campaigns won't. And where we probably have less healthcare because there's less money for the health service, but we can actually look after ourselves better, not because we're forced to, cajoled to, or social marketised to, but because it just seems the natural thing to do. And the creation of such a world, I think, is not a distant project, but the urgent project of the moment.
Very good. Well, I'm just going to add one thing, just picking up on what Professor Hastings said about the smoking ban, because it's puzzled me throughout this discussion that although we've been talking about cultural change and how we tackle the sort of long-term problem, that actually an event like the smoking ban was important not just because of its own legislative power, but of the way it accompanied a kind of cultural change. And I would argue that maybe the SNP, which is now set on a minimum pricing for alcohol, we haven't really talked about that at all, and there will be huge debates both sides of that argument. But I think possibly the introduction of that might have a similar catalytic change, because it'll focus so much attention on alcohol and the availability of alcohol and making it perhaps less available, that just possibly that might start the same kind of long-term change that the tobacco ban has had. So that's my little tuppence worth. I just really want to thank our four speakers. Also want to thank the RSE for laying. I've got one great solution to Scotland's appalling diet problem. We'll fill a lorry full of the food that we had up there. We'll take it into the centre of Easterhouse, and it'll be there for 3 weeks. And 3 weeks later, the people of Easterhouse will be demanding asparagus wrapped in Parma ham rather than deep-fried Mars bars. Anyway, thank you, RSE, and thank you for our 4 speakers. Thank you.